You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I want to welcome back to the program. I'm happy to have Steve Bucci, who's an expert with the Heritage Foundation, on a discussion that we're going to have today on the Ukraine. Steve, welcome back to the program. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me back again.
Well, thank you, Steve. And we have been discussing and following what has happened in Ukraine since it started up many months ago. And in this particular case, it's a little close to home for me, as my wife is actually, grew up in St. Petersburg, born in St. Petersburg, grew up in Latvia, and I have so many friends in and around that world, and many from Ukraine who live in my neighborhood, and in fact live right next door to me. And so I know what they're going through and their concerns with their members of the family who are still back there. And, some of them are, I guess you would say, more pro-Russian, and some are more pro-Western. And so it just depends on who you're speaking with. But I just relate it to what happened I know it's a little different, but what transpired in Bosnia and how that spiraled just completely out of control. And I think it's the last thing we'd want to see in Ukraine. And what I'd like to discuss with you today is the new president, Poroshenko, and what we could expect from that election. And I believe that he's having conversations with Vladimir Putin and trying to stabilize some of the things that are going on there. And I'd love to get your input and thoughts on those issues.
Sure. It's a tragic thing because when the Soviet Union broke up, they did a vote. They did a full, referendum on whether or not each of the former Soviet socialist republics wanted to separate from Russia. And the Ukraine voted, frankly, massively in favor of doing that. Even in the eastern part of the Ukraine, the majority voted in favor of separating. And even in Crimea, while the majority was the slimmest of the whole country there, was like 55 to 45 in favor of separating, it was in favor. And this occurred. Now, Putin has, staked out a position that, he really believes, not for terribly ideological reasons, but for old-fashioned power politics reasons, that these near-abroad countries, the countries that circle Russia, that are predominantly from the former Soviet Union, some of them are just Warsaw Pact countries, he thinks they should still be under Soviet influence, if you will, and in their sphere of responsibility. And he makes no bones about that. He said that to President Bush, and now he said it to the world by his actions. And it's a problem, because you can use that excuse of, well, there's ethnic Russians in this area, so I have the responsibility to go in there and protect them regardless of the international boundaries. You can play pretty fast and loose with that, which I think, frankly, he has.
No, that's a very good point. And for that matter, being that there's so many ethnic Russians living in my neighborhood, I suppose he can come here and protect them if he wanted to. So I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, by his theory, yeah, he could. And that puts, the Baltics, lots of other former Soviet republics who have generally fairly significant Russian minorities in their countries, makes them a little nervous that, Mr. Putin's going to apply this new doctrine to them. And, the Baltics are NATO allies, but is that going to deter Mr. Putin? I don't know. I mean, NATO's response was pretty muted, and we'll have to wait and see what he does and what the alliance does.
Now, there are so many complications in this story, and I'll just raise a few and then, of course, ask for your comment. The first is you had the first election where they basically took over the government. The president had fled to Russia, and then, you had a handful of people who were to be chosen from, and, of course, it was, I would have to say, it wasn't the most legitimate government in the way that all unfolded.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the biggest problems with that was that you had almost the West facing off against the Russian influence, and caught in the middle is Ukraine, which didn't exactly properly handle the situation, in my opinion. And I think it says more about the corruption and the base problems that exist within that country, which have led to their economic issues and all the other issues that are driving the instability, in my opinion. And so what I ask you is, with Petro Poroshenko now, I would consider it more of a legitimate election, and of course I think he is a legitimate businessman and somebody who could handle the position. But do you think that now he will be able to speak with the West and with Putin and others and try to work out some of the economic issues, try to stabilize some of the areas where you have the fighting and the conflict between the various factions, and in some cases I think would consider to be kind of the extreme wings on both sides, with everybody else caught in the middle?
Yeah, I think we've seen indications of that already, that he would be willing to talk to Putin. I mean, to be honest with you, the government in Kiev has no vested interest in going toe-to-toe with the Russians and, trying to put a sharp stick in their eye, because they're going to lose if it comes to blows. So I think it makes sense for him to at least begin the process of talking with Putin, because clearly Putin is the guy you have to talk to, not necessarily the leaders in the individual cities and that sort of thing. The problem that they have, though, is you've got the rest of the population who's sitting there going, well, what do we, chop liver? You're just going to dismember our country and allow these guys to run roughshod over the laws. So I think that may have been why he began his, in his inaugural address, he said, the Crimea is part of the Ukraine. So he's playing to his domestic constituency in the rest of the Ukraine. But I would be very surprised if in conversations and negotiations with the Russians, he did not say, okay, got it. Crimea is going to go with you guys. We'll have to live with that. But how about stirring up all the trouble in the other parts of eastern Ukraine? I think you'll see some accommodation there, mostly because I don't think he has a heck of a lot of choice. Yeah,
I agree with you on that. Question. I don't recall reading anything about Yanukovych, who was the one that had fled to Russia. Is he in play to be reestablished in any of these particular regions, like perhaps in the Crimea or some of the other eastern parts? Or
I have not heard. I mean, he pops up every now and then and says, yeah, this is an illegal government and that sort of thing. But I have not heard of any movement. Yeah, any movement trying to establish him as the leader in the eastern part of Ukraine and in opposition to Kiev. I think, Putin gambled with Yanukovych when he came in, and, he was starting to lean to the West, and then I think Putin put the screws to him and said, hey, buddy, I brought you to this dance. You need to dance with me. And so he shifted radically to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to go with Russia. And, the people in Kiev and around it just said, oh, wait a minute, we like this other idea you were pushing. Now suddenly you're shifting gears. And so, throwing him out, I don't have any problem with, but I think because I think he was sort of betraying the people that had elected him, at least, making a radical shift in direction that clearly they were not happy with and he was going to go ahead with anyway. But I would tend to agree with your earlier comment. The election that was then held, not the most democratic process in the world, but frankly, easily as democratic as the referendum they held in the Crimea, which had Russian soldiers standing outside all the polling places.
That's for certain.
Yeah, so I hope we can get stop the violence, number one, and get the various sides talking to one another. And, I think the Ukraine is going to come out on the short end of the stick here, the Ukraine as it was originally drawn after the breakup of the Soviet Union. But hopefully we can get back to the point where everybody's not looking over their shoulder in Kiev waiting for, Russian airborne troops and Spetsnaz to come show up. And that's kind of where, that's still a concern right now.
Yeah, that's a very good point. What's interesting when you go back in time a little bit to, and you mentioned it earlier, when a lot of these former Soviet countries were first splitting off and they had their referendums and made decisions about the future of their own individual countries, they had a significant military. I believe in a neighborhood of between 2,500 and 3,000 nuclear warheads of various types. Mm-hmm. And, of course, I think would they have around 12? I think it was around 1,200 tanks, or it could be even double that. I know it's a significant number.
Yeah, they weren't the biggest of the former Soviet Socialist Republics militaries, but it was a pretty decent chunk of military hardware, that's for sure.
Oh, certainly, and they pretty much gave it all up. And
they gave up the nukes, and then mm-hmm. they basically let the other stuff kind of go fallow, and they haven't been training to the degree they should, and a lot of the maintenance is down. So the military forces that they had left over, have basically atrophied quite a bit. And we'll see what comes out of that. Whether it, but to be honest with you, I personally like to see us go back to the thing where they didn't need that big military to protect themselves. That their big neighbor to the east there would say, okay, we're not going to come in and violate your borders anymore. But the problem is, the Russians see any turn to the west of the Ukraine and some of the other countries as a step too far. It was bad enough that the Baltics and Poland and all these other countries went over to NATO. To the Ukraine is just a little too close to the heartland of Russia for them to feel mm-hmm. comfortable with them turning totally to the west, and that's the problem. They see it as a threat to the way they define their interests, and that's problematic.
And that's a key term, actually, because when we look at and analyze this situation, that we have to look at it also from the perspective of the Russians and from Vladimir Putin and their leadership, because we can't always look through it at what we want, as well, at least you and I don't know mm-hmm. exactly what this particular administration really wants. I think that's a whole other segment. But you have to understand, and I guess one thing that sort of confuses me just historically is the fact that I thought we had been making pretty good inroads with the Russians with cooperation on a lot of different areas. One of the best areas of cooperation, of course, is with the International Space System. Mm-hmm. And, of course, unfortunately, our nation putting ourselves in a situation where we actually have to pay the Russians approximately $70 million every time we want to put one of our astronauts up into the space station, or even, because we mm-hmm. closed down our shuttle program. But there are a lot of areas that we're cooperating in, and I do believe that we made a couple missteps in asking them to support us or do certain things with regards to some of our operations in the Middle East or Africa. And I think we kind of, I wouldn't say screwed them over, but we didn't exactly follow through on everything that we had promised to do in every circumstance. So I think we are a little bit at fault here. But that being said, I think that perhaps the Russians have clearly had an agenda themselves to only take the cooperation to a certain point. Otherwise, they wouldn't be pushing the way they have in recent time.
Yeah, well, I think we need to remember that, Vladimir Putin sees Russia as a major world power. Mm-hmm. He'd really rather see it be even more so, more like it used to be with the Soviet Union, but I think he recognizes that they're at least going to be a significant regional power, or the most important regional power, but still be a significant player in other areas like the Middle East. And I think we're foolish if we, make the mistake to think he's just going to be a nice guy and do whatever we want him to do. That's foolish on our part to even expect that. He's going to follow what he believes are in the actions that are in the vital national interests of Russia, not what is good for the United States. And so that affects his decisions in that near abroad that we talked about. It also affects his relationship with Syria, with Iran. They're willing to help to a certain degree, but they're not going to put themselves at risk. I mean, Syria has been one of their biggest allies for a long, long time. All of those chemical weapons that Syria has, they got from Russia, and they didn't make all that stuff themselves. And the only outside naval port that Russia has is in Syria. So it's or naval base. So it's that's a pretty significant interest for them to try and maintain a friendly regime there.
Mm-hmm. Steve, do you have a few more minutes?
I do.
Okay. You just brought something up that I think we should really touch on, and that is, bringing Syria in and where some of these weapons are coming from. And I think if we step back and broaden the picture, and you look at China and you look at North Korea and even Russia, which are the three biggest suppliers of the weapons, which have been going to, say, Iran, to Syria, mm-hmm. to all these other conflicts within Africa, some of the major problems that exist in South and Central America, and I suppose parts of Europe now. But I could understand where the West is looking to put sanctions on these countries that are supporting these types of things. But I would also say that in many cases, we seem to want to punish Russia for their actions in Ukraine, but I think that China and North Korea have done equally as much, if not much more, in particular with the rise of the Iranian nuclear program, with other programs that have spread throughout the Middle East. And it's something that doesn't really get spoken of. In the mainstream media, it's always just a couple talking points. But I think that's a major issue, and we should address it by economic approach, in my opinion.
Well, we've had sanctions on North Korea for a long time, but then we periodically back them off because they make some promises that they seldom keep, and also just for humanitarian reasons because the people are just flat starving there. So we try and help them every once in a while, sometimes to our own detriment. China, it's a little harder to put economic sanctions on them because, one, their economy is so big, and two, we're frankly quite beholden to them as far as our national debt and other things. So our economic leverage against China is not terribly strong. But I agree with you that the Chinese, I think, have been one of the most interested observers of what's going on in the Ukraine, because they would very much like to see a international law precedent set with, for what Mr. Putin did, to make that legitimate, because they're going to use the same historical kind of arguments to justify actions that they've already been hinting at and pushing on and will probably take in the near future, particularly with regard to territorial disputes with Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, countries, two of which are treaty allies with us, and one that has, strange to somebody my age, has become very, very close to us as far as cooperation. And it's, the Chinese are going to take advantage of this. So, yeah, Putin is not alone in this effort. There are other countries that are behaving badly, at least according to international norms of behavior, and we need to address them as well.
That all excellent points, and I'm glad that you mentioned them. And I would just issue this warning to Vladimir Putin: don't trust the Chinese too long and too far, because eventually you will pay a price for getting into bed with them.
Oh, absolutely, and that's something that is yet to be seen, is the rivalry between those two, particularly out in the eastern part of Russia, bordering on China and vicinity. There's a lot of resources, a lot of mineral wealth there that has yet to be fully exploited, and China is a consumer of all that stuff. So I mean, I think there's, nobody wants a big giant war, but I tell you what, if those two start slugging it out, it's not going to be pleasant for anybody in the world.
No, that's true, and I'm actually shocked, to be honest with you, that we haven't seen at least a regional conflict erupt at this point with all the little fires, including some significant civil wars such as we're witnessing in Syria, unfolding over the last few years. So, I'm waiting for it to happen at any moment, because there's only so many different incidents that could happen without something accidentally, the wrong shot being fired, if you will.
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility.
Anyway, well, Steve Bucci, I want to thank you again so much. You spent an awful lot of time with us this week discussing some of these very critical and important issues, and I thank you, and I thank the Heritage Foundation. Of course, I'd love for you to provide and share with us the website for the Heritage Foundation so people could go check you guys out and find out some more information.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, and if anyone's interested, our website is at heritage.org, heritage.org. You can go there and you can get access to policy stuff from the international stuff that I do, all the way to, taxes and faith and family and everything in between. So we got it available as resources for your listeners, for education and or to share with others.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Okay, thanks for having me.
All right,
Bye-bye.
Take care.